Story number 1.
It had been years since the old grocery store closed down. The building was still standing, though every window was shattered and the door was half rotted. I had heard stories about it as a kid, tales told by older neighbors who always made sure to emphasize the eerie nature of the place, but it was mostly dismissed as nothing more than local folklore. I never thought much of it until one night when I found myself standing in front of it, the urge to explore growing stronger than my skepticism. I'd been working late that evening at a nearby diner, and when I was finished, the streets were empty and quiet. I had a flashlight in my bag, a habit of always carrying it in case the power went out at the diner, and on impulse, I decided to walk past the old building. I hadn't been down that way in years, and even as I approached, something about it felt different. The air was thick, almost oppressive, as though the building had an unnatural weight to it. I shrugged it off and kept walking, though a growing unease crept up my spine. It wasn't just the eerie quietness of the place, it was the feeling that something was watching me. The building had always given me the creeps as a kid. The way the streetlight cast its faint glow over the broken windows made it look like something was hidden inside, waiting. But tonight, I was determined to prove that it was just an old building, nothing more. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the loose gravel in the alleyway beside it. The front door was ajar, and although the sight of it made my heart race, I couldn't resist. Something about the opportunity to finally step inside drew me in, and before I could think twice, I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, their sound carrying into the night like a warning. Inside, the building was even worse than I had imagined. Dust settled over everything, and the air smelled stale and cold. What used to be aisles of food shelves now stood empty. The shelves warped and the labels faded. It was as if the building had been abandoned in a hurry. The floor was littered with broken glass and remnants of broken items, old cans, plastic wrappers, and shards of ceramic from who knows what. I took a few steps inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, though the only sounds were the ones I was making. The building felt vast in its emptiness, stretching out into shadowy corners where the light couldn't reach. I walked further into the store, my footsteps echoing in the stillness when I heard it. A sound from somewhere deep within the building, soft like something scraping across the floor. It was faint, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I froze, holding my breath, trying to make out the source. Nothing. The silence that followed was suffocating, but as I turned to leave, the noise came again, closer this time, like something dragging itself along the floor. It was enough to send a wave of panic coursing through me. I spun around, shining the flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I almost left then, ready to flee, but I couldn't bring myself to turn my back on the mystery. The thought that I had heard something, or worse, someone, was too much to ignore. I slowly moved down the nearest aisle, each step now hesitant, as if waiting for something to jump out at me. I crept along the rows, keeping my flashlight steady, when I saw it. A shadow in the distance, a dark shape that seemed to flicker and shift unnaturally. It was just a glimpse at first, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The shadow wasn't natural, not like the shadows cast by the wreckage of the store. It moved in ways that didn't make sense, sliding along the floor, almost like a person dragging themselves. It was too fast, too deliberate. I stepped back instinctively, but the sound of my movement must have alerted whatever, or whoever, was in that shadowed corner. The figure stopped moving, and the silence that followed was deafening. I barely dared to breathe. Then, without warning, the light from my flashlight flickered, and when it came back on, the shadow was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there at all. I stood motionless, my hands shaking as I aimed the light at the spot where the shadow had been. Nothing. I felt dizzy, like the world around me was starting to spin. I thought of leaving again, but a sickening curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. What if it was a person? A homeless person, maybe, hiding out in the abandoned store? The thought was just as terrifying as the possibility that it had been something else entirely. I took another cautious step forward. This time, my eyes didn't leave the corner, but as I reached the end of the aisle, something caught my eye, a small, glinting object on the floor. I bent down to inspect it, my mind racing with questions. It was a key, old and rusted, with a large, ornate handle. I couldn't remember ever seeing anything like it before. Then, as I straightened up, I saw it again. The shadow, this time not in the distance, but standing right in front of me. It was taller than any person, the edges of it flickering like the flame of a candle being blown by the wind. Its form was vague, but I could make out a face, a grotesque, distorted face, pale and hollow-eyed. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a soft, raspy breathing that seemed to echo in the back of my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the face of whatever this thing was. The shadow's eyes burned into mine, its presence suffocating, heavy, like it was pressing against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The building returned to its empty, lifeless state, leaving me standing there, trembling, feeling as if I had just woken from a nightmare I couldn't remember. I didn't wait for a second longer. I turned and ran, not caring if I tripped over debris or shattered glass. The exit was just ahead, and I didn't look back, even when I heard the scraping sound again, faint but unmistakable. Something was behind me. I burst out of the building, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until I was back at my car. I threw the key in the ignition, my hands shaking, and peeled out of the parking lot, my heart pounding so loudly that it almost drowned out the sound of the engine. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been nothing more than my mind playing tricks on me. But when I passed by the building later that day, I saw something strange, an old, rusted key lying in the gutter near the entrance. The same one I had found inside the store. I've never gone back to that building. The key is in a box somewhere, tucked away, though I've never been able to bring myself to throw it away. And every now and then, when I walk past the old store, I can't help but feel the same oppressive weight in the air. The sense that something is still watching from the shadows, waiting. The abandoned hospital at the edge of the city had been a source of local legend for decades. St. Vincent's General had closed its doors in the late 70s, following a series of mysterious deaths and allegations of malpractice. Now it stood as a decaying monument to the past, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti, and its long hallways echoing with stories of restless spirits. Megan had always been skeptical of ghost stories. She prided herself on being logical, practical, and not easily scared. So when her friends dared her to spend the night in the abandoned hospital, she accepted without hesitation. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a bottle of water, Megan planned to explore the building, document her experience, and prove once and for all that the stories were nothing more than urban legends. The night was cold and moonless as Megan approached the hospital. The building loomed like a dark shadow against the sky, its jagged edges blending into the surrounding trees. The main entrance was blocked by rusted metal gates, but someone had cut a hole in the chain-link fence nearby, creating a makeshift entrance. Megan squeezed through and stepped onto the cracked pavement of the hospital grounds. The air felt different as soon as she crossed the threshold. Heavier, colder. She brushed it off as nerves and headed toward the main entrance. The doors were missing, leaving a gaping hole that led into darkness. Megan turned on her flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom, and stepped inside. The lobby was eerily silent. The only sounds the crunch of broken glass under her boots and the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floor was littered with debris. A rusted wheelchair sat in the corner, its wheels slightly askew. Megan snapped a photo, the flash momentarily illuminating the space. She moved deeper into the hospital, her footsteps echoing down the long, empty corridors. The place smelled of mildew and decay, a scent that seemed to cling to her skin. Her flashlight beam revealed abandoned medical equipment, overturned gurneys, and faded signs pointing to various departments: radiology, surgery, pediatrics. Megan decided to start with the pediatrics wing. The thought of exploring a children's ward in an abandoned hospital sent a shiver down her spine, but she pushed the feeling aside. As she walked, she noticed that the air seemed to grow colder with each step, her breath now visible in the flashlight's glow. The door to the pediatrics ward was slightly ajar, creaking softly as she pushed it open. The room beyond was filled with rows of tiny beds, their metal frames rusted and their mattresses torn. Stuffed animals lay scattered on the floor, their button eyes staring blankly into the darkness. Megan took another photo, the flash revealing a mural on the far wall, a cheerful scene of children playing in a meadow. The colors were faded, but the smiles on the painted faces felt unsettlingly lifelike. As she moved through the ward, Megan heard a faint sound like the tinkling of a music box. She froze, straining to listen. The sound was faint but unmistakable, growing louder as she walked toward the far end of the room. Her flashlight beam landed on a small wooden box sitting on one of the beds. The lid was slightly open, revealing a spinning ballerina. Megan's stomach tightened. She hadn't seen the box when she entered the room, and there was no reason for it to be playing on its own. Slowly, she reached out and closed the lid. The music stopped abruptly, plunging the room into silence. She turned to leave, but as she did, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Whipping around, she shone her flashlight toward the mural. One of the painted children was staring directly at her. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew it was impossible. The mural hadn't changed. It was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the child's eyes seemed too real, too focused, as if they were watching her every move. Feeling a growing sense of unease, Megan left the pediatrics ward and made her way to the surgery wing. The hallway leading there was even darker, the walls covered in black mold and the air thick with the smell of rot. Her flashlight flickered, and she smacked it against her palm, cursing under her breath. The surgery wing was in worse condition than the rest of the hospital. Broken operating tables and rusted surgical instruments were scattered across the floor. Megan took another photo, her nerves fraying as the flash revealed shadows that seemed to shift and move. She was about to leave when she heard a low, guttural moan. It echoed through the wing, coming from somewhere deeper inside. Megan's blood ran cold. It could have been an animal, she told herself, or maybe the wind. But the sound had an unmistakably human quality. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound, her flashlight trembling in her grip. It led her to an operating room at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but a faint light seeped through the cracks. Megan hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But her curiosity got the better of her. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was bathed in a sickly green glow, emanating from an old surgical lamp hanging overhead. The operating table was intact, its leather straps stained and frayed. But what made her stomach churn was the figure lying on the table. It was a man, or what was left of him. His face was obscured by a bloodied surgical mask, and his body was covered in deep gashes as though he'd been torn apart. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Megan staggered back, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The sound seemed to wake the figure. His head turned slowly toward her, and his eyes met hers. They were empty, hollow, filled with a darkness that seemed to reach out and grip her soul. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Megan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure reached out a trembling hand, his fingers curling toward her. Suddenly, the surgical lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Megan scrambled to grab her flashlight, her hands shaking so badly that it took her several tries to turn it on. When she finally did, the room was empty. The table, the figure, the blood, it was all gone. She ran. Her boots pounded against the floor as she raced back the way she came, not caring about the noise she made or the photos she hadn't taken. She needed to get out of the hospital, needed to feel the cold night air on her face. But the hospital seemed to stretch endlessly, the hallways twisting and turning in ways they hadn't before. The walls closed in around her, and the oppressive silence was replaced by whispers. Dozens of voices speaking in hushed, frantic tones. "Leave. Get out. You shouldn't be here." Megan's flashlight flickered again, and this time it went out completely. She was left in total darkness, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. She fumbled for her phone, its weak screen light barely illuminating her surroundings. In the dim glow, she saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, lining the hallway. They stood motionless, their faces obscured, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Megan's scream caught in her throat as the figures began to move, closing in on her. She turned and ran, her phone's light bouncing wildly as she sprinted toward what she hoped was the exit. Finally, she saw it, the gaping hole of the main entrance. She burst through it and into the night, her lungs burning and her heart pounding. She didn't stop until she reached her car, fumbling with the keys and nearly dropping them in her haste. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The hospital stood silent and dark, its shattered windows reflecting the faint glow of the city. But in one of the windows, she saw a figure watching her. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its hand pressed against the glass as if bidding her goodbye, or warning her not to return. Megan never spoke of what happened that night, but she deleted every photo she had taken. The hospital remained standing, its secrets buried within its decaying walls, and the locals continued to tell their stories, warning anyone who would listen to stay far, far away from St. Vincent's General. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It started as a dare, like most foolish ventures do. My friend Jason had heard about the old mill on the outskirts of town, an abandoned brick factory that had been shuttered for decades. Locals whispered about strange noises, shadows that moved on their own, and an unshakable feeling of dread that hung around the property like a fog. "Bet you wouldn't last an hour in there," Jason had said, grinning over the rim of his beer. "I'll take that bet," I'd replied, feigning confidence. What's so scary about an old building? The mill wasn't hard to find. It loomed at the end of a gravel road, its crumbling brick walls and broken windows standing as a testament to neglect. The faded sign above the main entrance read, "Ridgeway Textile Co., though half the letters had fallen away. The chain-link fence surrounding the property was rusted and twisted, offering little resistance to anyone curious or reckless enough to enter. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and my phone for photos, I climbed through a gap in the fence. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, and the faint smell of mildew and burnt wood lingered. The stories I'd brushed off as nonsense earlier began to creep into my mind. The main door was gone, leaving a yawning entrance into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, shining my flashlight into the void. The beam illuminated a vast, open space filled with debris, broken machinery, shattered glass, and a tangle of vines that had crept inside over the years. I stepped inside, the sound of my boots crunching against the littered floor echoing in the stillness. The first thing I noticed was the quiet, not just the absence of sound, but an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow everything. As I moved deeper into the building, the air grew colder. My breath puffed out in white clouds, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. The flashlight beam flickered, but I chalked it up to old batteries. The first floor was mostly empty, save for rusted looms and piles of decaying fabric. I snapped a few photos, though the flash seemed to do little to pierce the gloom. In the corner of one photo, I thought I saw something, a shadow that didn't quite match the others. But when I looked again, it was gone. The stairs to the second floor were rickety, their wooden steps groaning under my weight. The stories about workers dying in accidents here, caught in machinery, falling from platforms, suddenly felt much more real. My footsteps slowed as I reached the landing. The second floor was different. The air was heavier, and the silence was broken by faint, indistinct noises like whispers carried on the wind. I strained to listen, but the words were impossible to make out. The room was filled with long work tables, their surfaces littered with rusted tools and scraps of fabric. A single sewing machine sat in the corner, its metal frame tarnished and its needle bent at an unnatural angle. As I approached, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't coming from a specific direction, but seemed to surround me, filling the air like an unseen presence. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the space. The figure didn't move. It was just a shadow, a trick of the light, or so I told myself. But as I took another step forward, the shadow seemed to shift, taking on a more defined shape. It was tall and thin, with elongated arms that hung unnaturally low. The flashlight went out completely. I fumbled with it, slapping it against my palm, but it refused to turn back on. I reached for my phone, using its weak light to guide my way back to the stairs. As I turned to leave, I heard it. A soft, deliberate scrape, like something being dragged across the floor. My pulse quickened, and I swung the phone's light around the room. Nothing moved, but the sound continued, growing louder and closer. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. The scrape followed me, echoing off the walls, accompanied now by faint, raspy breathing. By the time I reached the ground floor, my chest was tight with panic. I sprinted toward the exit, the oppressive silence now broken by the pounding of my own heartbeat. As I crossed the threshold, the sound stopped. The air outside was cold but lighter, the heavy dread lifting as soon as I stepped onto the gravel. I turned back, expecting to see something. But the mill stood silent and empty, its windows dark and lifeless. I drove home that night, promising myself I'd never go back. But curiosity got the better of me. When I reviewed the photos I'd taken, my stomach turned. In every image from the second floor, the shadowy figure was there, watching. And in the last photo taken just before I ran, it was closer. Much closer. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The old Harper building had been abandoned for nearly 40 years. A once bustling office space in the heart of a small industrial town, it now stood as a decaying monument to forgotten times. The locals avoided it, not just because of its crumbling walls or the broken glass that glittered like teeth in the moonlight, but because of the stories. Everyone in town had heard them, about the workers who vanished, the strange lights in the windows at night, and the screams that supposedly echoed through its empty halls. I didn't believe in ghosts, or at least I didn't think I did. But something about the Harper building fascinated me. Maybe it was the mystery or the challenge of proving the stories wrong. Either way, I decided to spend a night there, alone. I arrived just before sundown, carrying only a flashlight, a camera, and a backpack with some snacks and water. The building loomed before me, its once pristine brick facade now streaked with grime and ivy. The windows were either shattered or boarded up, and the main doors hung askew on rusted hinges. The air was unnaturally still as I stepped inside. The first floor was a mess of collapsed ceilings, broken furniture, and graffiti scrawled in haphazard patterns. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. I decided to start with the upper floors. The stairs creaked alarmingly under my weight, and the sound echoed up the empty stairwell. As I ascended, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I told myself. Just nerves. The second floor was eerily intact, as though the workers had left in a hurry and never returned. Desks were still arranged in neat rows, old rotary phones sitting silently on their surfaces. A calendar on the wall showed October 1982. I set my camera on one of the desks and started taking photos. The flash illuminated the room in harsh, brief bursts. In the silence, the click of the shutter seemed deafening. As I moved deeper into the floor, I noticed strange things. Papers strewn across the desks weren't yellowed or decayed as they should have been after decades of neglect. An old coffee mug still sat on one desk, its contents dried into a solid mass, but the mug itself strangely clean. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. The sun had set completely by the time I reached the third floor. This level was darker, colder. My breath puffed out invisible clouds, even though it was only October. The offices here were in worse shape. Ceiling tiles had fallen and water stains marred the walls. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like a distant whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the building. But as I strained to listen, I realized it was something else. It was a voice. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it seemed to come from the far end of the hall. I hesitated. Logic told me to leave, to turn back and call this whole thing a stupid idea. But curiosity, and maybe a touch of arrogance, kept me moving forward. The voice grew louder as I approached a door marked "Conference Room." The door was slightly ajar, and the whispering stopped as I reached for the handle. I pushed the door open with a creak and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, save for a long table and a dozen chairs. Dust covered everything, but the chairs were arranged neatly, as if waiting for a meeting that would never happen. At the center of the table was a leather-bound notebook. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam steady on the notebook. Its cover was cracked with age, and a faint, musty smell rose from it. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers brushing over the leather. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. At first, it seemed to be meeting notes, mentions of budgets, deadlines, and supply orders, but as I flipped through, the entries became more erratic. Lights flickering again. Electrical team says there's no issue, but we all saw it. Feels like someone is watching us. Karen hasn't shown up for 2 days. No one can reach her. Found her desk drawer open, photos missing. Something is wrong here. Can't sleep. Keep hearing voices when I'm alone. I'm not crazy. I know I'm not. The final entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. If anyone finds this, don't stay. It doesn't want us here. We aren't supposed to be here. A sudden bang from the hallway made me jump. The notebook slipped from my hands, landing with a dull thud. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Hello? My voice wavered, echoing down the empty corridor. No response. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight beam darting from wall to wall. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my chest. The sound came again, a sharp, deliberate knock, like someone tapping on a door. It was coming from the stairwell. I moved cautiously toward the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. As I reached the landing, I shone my flashlight down the stairwell. Nothing. The light caught something on the wall, a handprint smeared in what looked like ash or soot. It was small, like a child's hand, and fresh. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to leave, but my flashlight flickered and died. The stairwell plunged into darkness. Panic set in as I fumbled for my phone. The screen's faint glow provided little comfort. I turned it on and used the flashlight app, the weak beam barely illuminating the steps ahead. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder, echoing up the stairwell. They weren't mine. I was standing still. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate and unhurried. Who's there? My voice cracked, the words barely escaping my lips. No answer. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence, something unseen but undeniable. I turned and bolted, my phone's light bouncing wildly as I stumbled down the stairs. I hit the first floor and ran for the exit, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Just as I reached the doorway, I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, silent. Without looking back, I sprinted out of the building and into the night. The cold air burned my lungs as I reached my car, fumbling with the keys. I started the engine and sped away, the Harper building shrinking in my rearview mirror. When I got home, I locked every door and window, refusing to look at the photos on my camera. But curiosity won out the next morning. Every image was normal. Empty rooms, dusty desks, peeling paint, except for the last one. It was a photo of the stairwell, taken just before my flashlight died. In the corner of the frame was a figure, a shadowy silhouette with hollow eyes, watching. I haven't been back to the Harper building since, and I never will. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The old Carson Manor had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Located on the outskirts of our small town, the sprawling building had once been a thriving boarding house during the 1920s. By the 1970s, it had fallen into disrepair, earning a reputation as the haunted house on Maple Street. Locals swore the place was cursed. Rumors of disappearances, eerie sounds, and strange lights in the windows at night ensured nobody dared step inside, except me. I've always had an unexplainable fascination with the paranormal. I wasn't a thrill seeker or one of those people trying to prove ghosts exist, but there was something about the unknown that called to me. So when my friend Mike dared me to spend a night in Carson Manor, I didn't hesitate. Armed with a flashlight, my phone, and a sleeping bag, I set out just before sunset. The path to the house was overgrown, the once grand driveway now littered with weeds and broken stones. The closer I got, the more imposing the building appeared. Its sagging roof and boarded-up windows looked like hollow eyes staring into the gathering darkness. I climbed the creaky steps to the front porch and pushed the door open. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and rot, and dust swirled in the beam of my flashlight. The main hall stretched before me, its wooden floor warped and splintered. Faint graffiti decorated the walls, names, dates, and crude drawings left by previous intruders. "All right, Carson Manor," I muttered to myself, stepping inside. "Let's see what you've got." The first few hours were uneventful. I explored the ground floor, snapping photos and recording video on my phone. The rooms were filled with decaying furniture. An overturned table here, a moth-eaten armchair there. Most of the windows were boarded up, but one or two had gaps where pale moonlight seeped through, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The strangest thing was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Even my footsteps sounded muffled, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. Around midnight, I decided to check out the upper floors. The staircase was steep and rickety, the banister coated in a thick layer of dust. As I climbed, I noticed a faint chill in the air. It wasn't cold outside, but the temperature dropped noticeably with every step I took. The second floor was in worse shape than the first. Most of the doors were missing, revealing empty rooms littered with debris. My flashlight caught glimpses of peeling wallpaper, rusted bed frames, and broken glass. One room had a mirror hanging on the wall, its surface clouded and cracked. As I passed it, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, shining my light at the mirror, but there was nothing there, just my own pale reflection staring back. I laughed nervously. "Get it together, man," I muttered. Continuing down the hallway, I came across a door that was shut tight. Unlike the others, this one was intact, its surface scratched and worn, but still standing. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing what appeared to be a child's bedroom. The room was untouched, as if frozen in time. A small bed with a faded quilt sat against one wall, and a wooden rocking chair faced a window covered by tattered curtains. Toys were scattered across the floor, wooden blocks, a doll with missing eyes, and a tin soldier missing its arm. My flashlight beam landed on a small music box sitting on the nightstand. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The air was colder here, almost freezing. My breath puffed out in white clouds, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I approached the music box, noting the intricate carvings on its surface, tiny flowers and vines etched into the wood. My fingers hesitated before lifting the lid. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, a soft, lilting tune that filled the room. I didn't recognize the song, but it sent chills down my spine. As the music played, I heard something else, a faint giggle, high-pitched and childlike. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a shadow dart across the room. I slammed the lid shut and backed away, my heart pounding. The giggling stopped, but the oppressive feeling in the room remained. I turned to leave, but the door was closed. I hadn't touched it, and I was sure I'd left it open. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The silence was deafening. The doorknob was icy cold as I grabbed it, twisting with all my strength. It wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help even though I knew no one was around. Then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The rocking chair was moving. Slowly, methodically, it creaked back and forth as if an invisible figure was sitting in it. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed something else. The doll that had been lying on the floor was now sitting upright, its eyeless face turned toward me. A voice whispered, barely audible but chilling in its clarity. "Stay and play." That was enough for me. I rammed the door with my shoulder, ignoring the pain as it finally gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, my flashlight flickering wildly. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I ran, down the stairs, through the main hall, and out into the night. I didn't stop until I was in my car, locking the doors and speeding away without looking back. When I got home, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. The darkness, the silence, the history of the place, it had played tricks on my mind. But when I checked my phone, the photos I'd taken told a different story. In one of the pictures from the child's bedroom, a figure stood near the rocking chair. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakable. A little girl in a white dress, her face obscured by shadows. I haven't gone back to Carson Manor, and I don't plan to. The house can keep its secrets. Some places are better left undisturbed. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
It had been years since anyone had dared to step inside the old Fairfax textile mill. The mill was a hulking mass of rusted iron and rotting wood that stood on the edge of town, its high windows dark like hollow eyes. From what I had heard, it was once a bustling factory that employed hundreds of workers, producing textiles that were sold across the country. But after a tragic fire in the late 60s that killed several workers, the mill was shut down. And after that, the stories started. People said that the souls of those who died in the fire still lingered there, trapped in the smoke-filled hallways. I hadn't believed the stories. I never did. Ghosts were just things people made up to explain the unexplainable, or so I thought. Then, one night, my friends and I were sitting around a fire, drinking beer and talking about the old mill. The conversation eventually shifted to whether anyone had ever dared to spend the night there. They dared me, and I, being the stubborn fool that I was, accepted. The next evening, I found myself standing outside the mill, flashlight in hand. The building loomed over me, its cracked walls overgrown with ivy, the roof sagging in places as if it were about to collapse. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and old machinery. My heart pounded, but I chalked it up to nerves. After all, it was just an old factory. Nothing more. The front door was half open, and I pushed it with little effort, the hinges protesting with a loud squeak. Inside, it was colder than I had expected. The air felt heavy, thick, and stagnant. Dust hung in the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet with every step. I took a few photos of the interior, ruined machinery, overturned crates, shattered windows. The decay was everywhere, and the silence, the complete and utter silence, made my skin crawl. I tried to shake off the unease that was growing in my chest as I ventured further inside. I'd read about how old buildings often make you feel like you're being watched, but I didn't think that applied to me. Still, something about the place felt off. The flashlight flickered, then went out completely. I cursed under my breath and tried to turn it back on, but it wouldn't work. I wasn't sure what it was, but the darkness in the mill felt somehow different, more oppressive. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pulled out my phone, using its light to guide me through the building. The factory floor stretched out ahead, massive and empty, with rows of old machinery that had long since stopped whirring. The walls were covered in soot from the fire, and the metal beams above were twisted and warped. The entire place seemed frozen in time, as though it had been abandoned in a hurry, its workers vanishing in an instant. I walked past old storage rooms and broken windows, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. I didn't expect to find much, just an empty building and maybe a few interesting relics from the past. But the further I went, the more unsettling things became. The first strange thing I noticed was the temperature. The air grew colder as I moved toward the back of the mill. It wasn't just the natural drop in temperature you'd expect in an abandoned place, but a sudden and sharp chill, like stepping into a freezer. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and kept walking. Then I heard it, a faint tapping. It was so quiet at first that I thought I might have imagined it. But as I stood still listening, it came again. A light, rhythmic tapping, almost like the sound of a distant hammer tapping on metal. I turned, expecting to see someone walking toward me, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing there. The tapping continued, but it wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was coming from deeper within the building, somewhere far off in the darkness. Something urged me to turn back, to leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I started moving toward the source of the sound. I rounded a corner and found myself facing a large open area filled with old equipment and stacks of forgotten materials. But there, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. The figure was hunched over, its back to me, seemingly focused on something in its hands. It was hard to make out details in the low light, but the outline of the person was unmistakable. My heart rate quickened. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" There was no response. I took a step forward, my voice cracking. "Hello?" Still nothing. I hesitated for a moment, then took another step, and as I did, the figure turned. Its face was pale, lifeless. Hollow eyes stared at me from a face that looked like it had been through years of decay. The mouth opened, but no sound came out. I froze. The figure raised one of its arms, pointing toward the far corner of the room. The tapping sound grew louder, now unmistakably coming from that direction. It was as if the figure was urging me to follow, and despite every instinct telling me to run, I couldn't look away. I walked forward, my feet feeling like they were made of lead, each step a battle. The figure didn't move, but its eyes never left me. As I neared the corner, the tapping grew louder still. My breath came in short bursts. I rounded the corner and saw what was making the sound, an old sewing machine. It was sitting in the middle of the room, its pedal tapping against the ground, moving on its own. My stomach churned. I knew no one else was in the building. I was completely alone. Yet this machine was working, tapping out a rhythm as if someone or something was using it. The coldness intensified. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. I spun around, ready to leave, but the hallway behind me had changed. It wasn't the same as before. The walls were different, darker somehow, and the door I had entered through was gone. I was trapped. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to find another way out. I ran through the building, but every door I tried was locked. The whole place seemed to have shifted, its familiar corridors twisting into unfamiliar paths. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick, suffocating. The tapping followed me, relentless, growing louder with every step I took. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper, but a low, guttural sound, something between a moan and a scream. I turned a corner and found myself back where I had started, standing in the middle of the factory floor. The machinery around me groaned as if it was coming back to life, and that's when I saw it again. The figure. This time it wasn't still. It was moving toward me slowly, deliberately. I could hear its footsteps echoing in the silence, and as it drew closer, I saw that its hands were outstretched toward me. Its eyes were empty, its face twisted in an expression of anguish. I turned and ran, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, the night cold against my skin. I never went back to the Fairfax textile mill. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that the dark had gotten to me. But every time I drive past that building, I feel a shiver run down my spine. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, when everything is still and silent, I hear the tapping. It's faint, but it's there, and it's calling me back. The end.
Story number 7.
I had always been a bit of a skeptic. Ghosts, spirits, haunted places, those were just stories, the kind people tell to entertain or scare themselves. I wasn't one to believe in the supernatural, but that all changed one night when I decided to explore the old Wallace factory. The factory had been abandoned for nearly 40 years. It was a massive structure with brick walls covered in vines, broken windows, and a sagging roof. The townspeople spoke about it in hushed tones, warning kids to stay away. The stories were mostly about strange noises at night, the flickering of lights, and the occasional sighting of shadowy figures through the windows. Most people dismissed it as superstition, but something about the factory intrigued me. I had passed by it hundreds of times, but it wasn't until one chilly evening in the fall that I decided to finally see it for myself. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the abandoned building. I parked my car on the side of the road and grabbed my flashlight. I wasn't expecting to find anything, but I had heard enough to be curious. I figured I'd take a quick look around and head home before dark. The rusted gate creaked as I pushed it open. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the wind rustle the leaves and the occasional groan of the building settling. There was an eerie stillness in the air. No birds, no animals, just the sound of my own breath. I stepped inside. The ground was littered with broken glass and debris, the remnants of the factory's past life. I made my way through the overgrown yard, the sounds of my footsteps the only thing breaking the silence. The building itself loomed ahead, its dark windows like empty eyes staring down at me. The front door was partially ajar, hanging on a single hinge. I pushed it open with a grunt, and the door groaned in protest. Inside, the air was musty and thick with the scent of decay. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight as I swept it across the room. The floor was covered in broken tiles and wood, remnants of old machinery scattered throughout. There was a sense of abandonment here, but it wasn't just the derelict state of the building. It was the way the place felt, as if it had been left in a hurry. Its history abruptly halted. I moved deeper into the factory, passing rows of rusted metal and old workbenches. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the place became. The sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. I was just about to turn back when I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. It was barely audible, but it stopped me dead in my tracks. I held my breath, straining to hear. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again. A soft, low murmur, followed by a sound that sent a chill down my spine, a faint, rhythmic tapping. I stood there for a moment, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. It was probably just the building settling, or an animal, maybe a rat scurrying around. But the tapping wasn't random. It had a pattern, like someone was knocking, or maybe working. I slowly moved toward the sound, my flashlight beam flickering as I walked deeper into the factory's heart. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, and now I could hear a soft scraping noise mixed in with it. As I rounded a corner, I saw it. At the far end of the factory floor, there was an old workbench, and sitting at it was a figure, a person, hunched over, working with something. The figure was shrouded in shadow, and the only thing visible was the outline of their shoulders and the slow, rhythmic movement of their hands. I couldn't make out any details, but I felt my pulse quicken. Was someone else here? Maybe another curious soul like me? I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty space. Hello? The figure didn't respond. It continued working, completely oblivious to my presence. Or perhaps it simply didn't care. I took a tentative step forward, then another. The tapping stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. I was close enough now to see that the figure was still hunched over the workbench, its head lowered. It seemed to be focused on whatever it was doing, if not noticing me at all. Are you okay? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't move. I felt a knot form in my stomach. This was strange, far too strange for my rational mind to process. I was beginning to feel like I should leave, but before I could turn to go, the figure straightened up. I froze. The figure's head lifted, and that's when I saw it. Its face was pale, gaunt, its eyes wide open and lifeless, as though they had never blinked. The skin was pulled tight across its skull, and its mouth hung slightly open, as if it were trying to say something. The most unsettling part wasn't its appearance, it was the utter emptiness in its gaze. It didn't look at me, it stared through me like I wasn't even there. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs wouldn't move. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, staring at this thing. Then, as quickly as it had happened, the figure slumped forward, its body collapsing back onto the workbench. I blinked, and in the space of a heartbeat, the figure was gone. The workbench was empty. The tapping sound returned as if nothing had happened. I turned and fled. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted back toward the exit, my flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building, gasping for air in the cold night. I didn't look back. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was a ghost, a hallucination, or my mind playing tricks on me, but I haven't been able to shake the memory. I never went back to the Wallace factory. The place still stands, though, empty and silent. And sometimes when I pass by it late at night, I swear I hear that faint tapping sound again, echoing in the darkness. Story, the end.
Story number 8.
I had always been fascinated by abandoned places. Growing up, I spent my weekends exploring decaying structures, whether they were forgotten factories or decrepit houses. I was never scared. After all, they were just empty buildings, remnants of the past. Or so I thought. It was a late fall evening when I heard about the old Westfield Mill, a massive structure that had stood on the outskirts of our town for over a century. The mill had been abandoned for nearly 30 years after a tragic accident that claimed the lives of several workers. The official story was that a fire broke out one night, and many of the workers were trapped inside. The building was deemed too dangerous to restore, and since then, the place had been left to decay. Locals always spoke of the mill in whispers. They claimed it was haunted. I wouldn't go near it if I were you, they'd say. Bad things happen there. But like most of the ghost stories that circulated in the town, I didn't take them seriously. People were just looking for something to explain the eerie atmosphere. So when my friends dared me to go inside the mill one night, I couldn't resist. It was a Friday night when I made the decision to go. The moon was barely visible behind the clouds, and the air had a bitter chill. I packed my bag with a flashlight, a camera, and my phone. My friends insisted on coming with me. but I told them I'd go alone. I wanted to experience it on my own terms. Besides, the more I thought about it, the more the idea excited me. The mill stood at the edge of town, on a plot of land surrounded by tall trees that had long overtaken the property. The gravel driveway leading up to the entrance was overgrown with weeds, and the sign that once read Westfield Mill was barely legible, its letters chipped away by years of neglect. I stood at the entrance for a moment, staring up at the imposing structure. It was bigger than I had imagined. The stone walls were cracked, and large sections of the roof had collapsed, exposing the rafters. The windows were mostly broken, their jagged edges giving the building a skeletal appearance. The place looked like it had been frozen in time. I took a deep breath and pushed open the rusted metal gate. It creaked loudly as it swung open, sending a shiver down my spine. I stepped onto the property, my boots crunching on the gravel beneath me. My flashlight illuminated the dark interior, revealing shattered windows, old wooden beams, and scattered debris. The smell of mildew and decay was overwhelming. I walked toward the main entrance, which was an old wooden door, slightly ajar. I paused for a moment, listening to the silence. There were no sounds, not even the wind. It was as if the place was holding its breath. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The main room was massive. My flashlight beam bounced off the walls, revealing piles of broken equipment, old machinery, and scattered remnants of the factory's past. A rusted conveyor belt lay abandoned on the floor, its gears frozen in time. There were strange symbols etched into the walls, faded and worn, as though someone had scratched them there in desperation. I walked deeper into the building, my footsteps echoing through the empty space. The air felt thick, heavy with dust and neglect. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I moved further into the mill, I noticed something strange. The temperature seemed to drop. It wasn't just the natural chill of the evening. It was as if the air itself had turned cold, like a draft was sweeping through the building. I tightened my jacket around myself and pushed on, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I entered a narrow hallway, and that's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I realized it was something else, a faint sound like footsteps. It was a slow, deliberate pace, as if someone was walking just ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, listening. My heart began to race. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. The sound of footsteps continued, echoing through the empty hall. I turned the corner and walked down another hallway, but the footsteps were gone. The silence returned. I paused, trying to steady my breath. Maybe it was just the building settling. Old buildings creaked and groaned all the time. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid. I moved deeper into the mill, my flashlight now shining on a series of old doors lining the hallway. Each one was locked, the handles rusted and immovable. I tried to open a few, but they wouldn't budge. I was about to turn back when I noticed one door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar. I approached it cautiously, my heart thumping in my chest. As I pushed the door open, the cold air hit me like a slap. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. It was a small office, with a desk piled high with papers, some yellowed with age. A few old filing cabinets lined the walls. I stepped inside, feeling an odd sense of dread wash over me. There was something off about this room. The air was heavier here, almost suffocating. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself it was just my imagination. As I moved deeper into the room, I noticed something strange on the wall. A series of marks, scratches, like something or someone had clawed at the plaster. They weren't random, they seemed deliberate, organized. It was almost as though they spelled something. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something move in the corner of the room. I whipped around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded in my chest. That's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time they were closer. It wasn't the faint echo of distant steps, but the unmistakable sound of someone walking right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. There was no one there. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I stood frozen in place, my mind racing. I was alone. I knew I was alone. But the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, was overwhelming. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my breath shallow and quick. I turned to leave the room, but as I reached the door, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck. It was like a whisper, but I heard no sound. I whipped around again, but the room was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled back into the hallway. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to get out. I ran through the mill, my footsteps pounding against the floor, my flashlight darting around the dark corridors. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I turned a corner, every time I glanced behind me, there was nothing but darkness, but I could still feel it. Something close, just out of sight. Finally, I made it to the front door. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. As I stepped outside, the air felt warmer, the tension slowly easing from my shoulders. I looked up at the mill, my heart still racing, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move behind one of the broken windows. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't return to the mill. I couldn't. The memories of that night, the cold air, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me long after I left. I never told anyone about what happened, not wanting to sound crazy, but I'll never forget the way it felt inside that building, and I'll never go near it again. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I had always prided myself on being a rational person. I wasn't one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural, but I had heard enough strange stories about the old Armstrong factory to make me curious. It had been abandoned for decades, and over the years, the building had become a local legend. People in town told stories about strange noises, flickering lights, and mysterious figures that could be seen through the cracked windows at night. They said the place was haunted by the spirits of workers who died in an accident years ago. Naturally, I didn't buy any of it, but I figured it was worth a visit to see for myself. It was a quiet Sunday evening when I decided to go. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape, and the air had a crisp chill to it. I grabbed my camera, a flashlight, and my phone, hoping to capture some interesting photos while I explored the place. The Armstrong factory wasn't far from where I lived, just a few miles out of town, but it felt like another world entirely. As I drove, the road grew narrower, the trees thicker, and the factory came into view, looming in the distance like a dark, forgotten monument to the past. The factory was a massive structure made of red brick, with large windows that had long since shattered, leaving jagged edges in their wake. The roof sagged in places, and vines had crept up the walls, claiming the building as their own. The stories I'd heard had always painted the place as unsettling, but seeing it in person sent a shiver down my spine. It was even worse than I had imagined. Silent, desolate, and foreboding. I parked my car on the side of the road and walked toward the factory entrance. The gate was rusted and half open, creaking as I pushed it aside. I stepped through, my boots crunching against the gravel beneath me. The building seemed to swallow the sound, leaving an eerie stillness in the air. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Rationally, I knew there was nothing to fear. But still, something about the place felt off. The main entrance was a large wooden door that had been left ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air inside was thick with dust, and the musty smell of decay filled my nose. The walls were covered in grime and peeling paint, and broken machinery lay scattered across the floor like forgotten relics of the past. I made my way through the building, snapping photos as I went. The further I ventured inside, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, made me jump. I kept telling myself it was just the building settling, but I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. I entered what appeared to be the main work area. The space was vast, with rows of old machines and tools strewn about. The silence was deafening. My flashlight swept over the rusted equipment, and I couldn't help but wonder about the workers who had once labored here. Had they known that the factory was doomed? Had they felt the same eerie presence that I now felt? I took a few more steps, then paused when I heard something, a faint sound in the distance. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, like the sound of footsteps echoing through the building. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I stood completely still, straining my ears. The footsteps continued, growing closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer. I took a few cautious steps toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I rounded the corner, the noise abruptly stopped. I glanced around, but the area was empty. No one was there. My mind raced. Was it the wind, the building settling, or something else? I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing, when suddenly I heard a loud bang from behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. My flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. My breath quickened, and my skin prickled with a cold sweat. I was alone, at least I thought I was. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Without thinking, I turned and ran, not caring about the photos I had taken or the mystery of the factory. I just wanted to get out. As I sprinted through the hallways, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. It was quick, too quick to be real, but it was enough to make me stop in my tracks. My flashlight flickered again, and I heard a faint whisper like a voice just beyond my hearing. I was near the exit now, but the door was further than it had seemed before. I rushed toward it, my breath coming in short gasps, but it felt like the building was stretching out before me. Every step seemed to take longer, the distance greater. The door that had once been so close now seemed impossibly far away. As I reached the entrance, I froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure, a tall, shadowy form that seemed to blend into the darkness. My heart skipped a beat. I could barely make out its shape, but it was there. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure remained motionless, watching me. I backed away slowly, my flashlight flickering one last time before it went out completely. I fumbled with it in the dark, but I couldn't get it to work. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence, like it was waiting for me to make the first move. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. There was no sound, no movement, just silence. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, stumbling over debris and broken glass as I sprinted for the exit. When I finally made it outside, I didn't stop running. I ran all the way back to my car, my breath ragged and my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't look back at the factory, but I could still feel the presence of that figure, standing in the doorway, watching me. When I got home, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. Rationally, I knew there was no explanation. The building was old and decaying, and the noises I heard could have easily been the wind or the building settling. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that factory with me. Something that didn't belong. The next morning, I went through the photos I'd taken the night before. Most of them were blurry or out of focus, but one photo stood out. In the background of one of the pictures, I could see a figure, faint but unmistakable. It was the same shadowy form I had seen in the doorway. I don't know what I saw that night, whether it was a ghost, a figment of my imagination, something else entirely. But I do know this: I will never go back to the Armstrong factory. Some places are best left undisturbed. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
The Armstrong mill had been abandoned for nearly 30 years when I first saw it. Sitting at the edge of town, its towering smokestack poked at the sky like a skeletal finger, pointing toward a past best forgotten. The factory had been the heart of the small community for decades until a catastrophic fire had torn through its halls one night, killing several workers and destroying everything inside. They said it was arson, but the truth was never fully uncovered. The town had moved on, but the mill, silent, forgotten, and broken, remained. People in town didn't talk much about the mill anymore. They preferred to pretend it wasn't there, as if acknowledging its existence would bring back the dark memories. But as I drove past the crumbling gates day after day, something about it always caught my eye. There was something haunting in its stillness, like the building was waiting, biding its time for something, or someone to return. One evening, I made the decision to finally see it for myself. I was alone, just as I always was when curiosity got the better of me. It was a crisp autumn night, and the wind rustled the dry leaves that scattered the empty streets. My heart raced a little faster as I turned off the main road and onto the gravel path that led to the mill. The sound of the tires crunching over the stones felt unnervingly loud against the quiet of the evening. When I arrived, the mill loomed before me in the dimming light. The windows were shattered, and ivy crept up the sides of the building, as though nature itself was trying to reclaim what had been lost. The gates were rusty, but still hanging on their hinges, barely open, just enough for me to slip through. I parked my car at the edge of the property and stepped out, my boots kicking up the dust from the neglected ground. It felt colder here than it had felt just a few minutes ago. I zipped my jacket up tighter and shone my flashlight at the ground, following the path that led to the main entrance. The building stood in eerie silence. No sounds of birds or the distant hum of cars. Just the wind brushing against the broken windows and the occasional creak of the metal gates behind me. My breath formed in little clouds as I moved closer to the door. I pushed it open carefully, and the hinges groaned in protest. Inside, the air smelled damp and musty, like old wood and rust. The faint light from my flashlight danced along the walls, illuminating piles of discarded machinery and forgotten tools that had once served the factory's purpose. It was hard to imagine that just a few decades ago, this place had been alive with activity, filled with the hum of machines and the buzz of workers. Now it was dead, a hollow shell that seemed to have forgotten itself. I took another step inside, the floor creaking under my weight. I paused for a moment, listening for any signs of movement, footsteps, voices, anything that might indicate that I wasn't alone. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I pushed forward, deeper into the building, each room more dilapidated than the last. Broken windows let the cold breeze inside, and the air felt thick, like something had been trapped here for years. It was then that I heard it. A soft, distant sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic. It was the sound of something scraping along the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The noise grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was just around the corner. I stepped forward cautiously, my breath shallow, and peered into the hallway ahead. It was dark, the flashlight beam barely making it past the first few feet. The scraping sound stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything felt still again. I stood there, straining to hear anything more. It was then that I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just past the crumbling doorway, there was a shadow. It was moving, shifting, but too slowly to be natural. I froze, my hand gripping the flashlight tightly, my mind racing. The figure was tall, impossibly so, with a vague form that seemed to waver in the dim light. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to shift, as though it were made of smoke or mist. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't look away. Suddenly, the shadow jerked forward, snapping out of the darkness like a bolt of lightning. I gasped, stumbling backward, my flashlight falling to the floor with a crash. The cold air seemed to press in around me, and my skin prickled with an overwhelming sense of dread. I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it back on, but the shadow was gone. I blinked, heart hammering, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. My breath came in shallow bursts as I backed away from the hallway. It was then that I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, dragging along the floor, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming closer, too close. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the old wooden floors, my breath ragged in my chest. The factory seemed endless, the hallways stretching out in every direction. I could hear the footsteps behind me, following, always just a step away. The air grew colder with every corner I turned, and the weight of something unseen pressed down on me, suffocating me with its presence. I didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. I could feel the walls closing in, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. The door. I had to reach the door. It was the only way out. My hand grasped the cold metal of the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. I tugged at the door with all my strength, but it was stuck, as though something was holding it closed on the other side. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was thick, almost oppressive. I stood there, trembling, my body cold with fear, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I knew something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. I took a deep breath and tried again, this time with more force. The door gave way, creaking open just enough for me to slip through. I rushed outside, my eyes wide, scanning the area for any sign of movement, but everything was still. The cold wind hit my face as I stood on the gravel path, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. I didn't stay long. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys and started the engine. I didn't look back at the mill as I drove away, but I could still feel the weight of the building behind me, watching, waiting. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the old factory had gotten to my head. But when I went through the photos I had taken, I found something odd. In one of the pictures, just behind the shattered window of the factory, there was a figure. A tall, dark shape that shouldn't have been there. I don't go near the Armstrong Mill anymore. I haven't been back since that night, and I never plan to. There are some places in this world that should be left alone, and the mill is one of them. Story the end.